brought along its own little high-speed portable cache buffer of memory, which made things work incredibly faster. So the 486 was a breakthrough. Then we have here the 586 processor, which really wasn't called a 586, it was called a Pentium. The first Pentium came out in 1993 and had just over 3 million transistors on it. The Pentium was also, like the 386 and 486 before it, was a 32-bit processor. Now, that concept of cache I was telling you about, yes, the Pentium also had the cache built into it, but this was what we call level 1 cache. During those times, level 2 cache was still found on the motherboard, and therefore it ran at slower motherboard level speeds instead of higher or faster processor level speeds. So the next processor would change this radically. This was called the Pentium Pro, which is right here, which came out in 1995. Now the Pentium Pro was really a revolutionary chip. For one thing, it's huge. It's physically probably the largest single chip I've ever seen. And the reason is because there's actually not one chip in there, there's two. This, in fact, represents the actual die of the Pentium Pro processor. And if I set it on here, you'll see why this chip was rectangular, because there were basically two chips side by side. One of them is the actual processor chip, and it has its own built-in level 1 cache memory. The other chip next to it is a level 2 cache memory chip. Now prior to this, the level 2 cache had been on the motherboard. Now it was part of the processor, but it was still a separate chip. Now this dual chip in a package processor was very expensive to produce, so it wasn't very popular because it was expensive. So Intel was working on the problem of how can they make this type of a chip with the cache built into it less expensive. Well, what they came up with was the concept of a circuit board as a processor. Now this is actually a Pentium 3 processor, but the Pentium 2 and 3 both did this. In fact, these are really P6 or 686 processors, just like the Pentium Pro. And what we have is the actual processor chip here and then cache memory alongside of it. And what this allowed Intel to do was to literally buy cache memory chips from third-party suppliers, like the ones on this are actually from Samsung, and integrate them into a circuit board. Now this type of a board would plug into a slot. Now I think Intel was possibly a little vain about this. They didn't want you to see that they were using other companies' cache memory chips on here. So what they did in the Pentium 2 packaging was they built it into a plastic case. So this little circuit board is in this thick plastic case, has a heat sink built onto it, and in fact they even have a picture of the die of the processor on the side. This was the first processor that I knew of that featured what I would call decoration. The Pentium 3 was really the same thing. The Pentium 3 was just an enhanced version of the Pentium 2 processor. Now the Pentium 2 came out in 1997 and the Pentium 3 came out in 1999. All of these continued that technology of building the level 2 cache into the chip, but it was separate chips. It was a multi-chip package. Well, finally, both Intel and AMD created small enough transistors. The process had gotten tight enough to where they could pack the level 2 cache chips into the main processor just like the level 1. Now in continuing this evolution, talking about processor packaging, most of the time when a processor is made, you don't actually see the die. It's covered up. Well, some chips were made where you did see the die. I showed you this Pentium 3, and you can actually see the raw silicon die on top of this chip. That's the actual silicon base of the processor. Now it is flipped upside down, so the circuits themselves are not visible. They're turned around. But still, that's the raw silicon die. Now there was a problem with this design that when you attached a heat sink to it, it's basically perched on this little pedestal of silicon.